Flagship community educational outreach program at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida, bringing together intellectuals and entertainers from Florida and around the nation to engage in discourse, debate, and enlightenment in the spirit of the French salons of the 18th century. Beacon College is America's first accredited college or university dedicated to educating students primarily with learning disabilities, ADHD, and other learning differences. But foremost, Beacon is a rigorous liberal arts school, and the Salon Speaker Series honors its duty as an institution of higher learning to uplift the community, spark engagement, and sow seeds of conversation and discovery. In this installment of the Beacon Salon Speaker Series, you'll discover the finer points of editorial cartooning. British politician George Osborne once said, when asked about political cartooning, "The great thing about a political cartoon is that it sums up the state of play at any moment in politics. It's clever, funny, amusing. It informs and entertains us. It does all the things in one drawing that a newspaper does throughout all of its pages." We'll learn more about the power of one picture, or in this case, a cartoon, to cut to the chase from our featured speaker, Glenn Marty Stein. Stein served as an editorial cartoonist and illustrator at the Orlando Business Journal, the Apopka Chief, and the Spanish-language newspaper La Prensa, where he also wrote and drew his original comic strip, Oasis. Please stay with us after his talk for a Zoom Q&A where you can ask Stein questions. There's still time to register for the webinar. Visit beaconcollege.edu/salon. And now, the Beacon Salon Speaker Series is honored to present Glenn Marty Stein.
I thought a little warm-up might be in order, and I'd introduce everyone to the plight of a cartoonist. Well, the plight really goes back to a story several years ago where my wife had a friend whose child was ill. And being the kind-hearted soul I am, I decided to draw a picture of the cat in the hat, which I did, and I took it over, knocked on the door, and the child's mother answered the door, and I went in and I gave the cat in the hat to the child. The child immediately proceeded to take a crown and scrawl all the way across the picture. Well, the mother took the picture and handed it to me and asked, "Can you fix this?" Well, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember what I was thinking at the time. So that really represents the plight of a cartoonist. Sometimes you get respect and, well, sometimes you don't. But let's go back to the early days of when I started my editorial cartooning. This would be the 1980s when I was a student at the University of Florida. A lot of people thought that I was a political science major. In fact, I was a public relations major with a minor in history at the time. I guess they thought I was a political science major because I was always interested in current events. And at one point in 1983, I decided I would give a go at doing some editorial cartooning for the Independent Florida Alligator, the student newspaper. So in September of that year, I had my first published cartoon, and the sketch is shown here, where Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader at the time, was invading Chad. Now, one of the important things about editorial cartooning is an editorial cartoon has to have immediacy. And when I say immediacy, the reader has to really get the idea of the cartoon in about 5 seconds. It's just that quick. Also, too, since English is read from left to right and top to bottom, that's the flow of the cartoon as well. Now, in this cartoon, you can see how Gaddafi is represented as the devil, and he is literally taking over the country of Chad. And that's the whole cartoon. That's it right there. Now, after I had that cartoon published, I decided editorial cartooning would be my focus for the future. By the spring of 1985, after I graduated, I had my first professionally published cartoon in the Gainesville Sun. Now, this became a lesson in humility, and it did so because the cartoon subject was the scandal that was going on in the state at the time involving car insurance. So I had used a very well-known symbol of the Prudential Insurance Company and the title, Get a Piece of the Rock. That was the jingo they used at the time. And I had this tunnel underneath the Rock of Gibraltar and dynamite placed under there. Well, what happened is the person who was the representative of the Prudential Insurance Company complained to the Gainesville Sun and said that Prudential actually handled very, very little of the car insurance for the state of Florida. So it was a good example of me pretty much having to do my homework before I did a cartoon. But fortunately, that sort of thing rarely happened during the time I was editorial cartooning. By January of 1986, I had written a letter to the Orlando Sentinel editorial cartoonist Dana Summers. And I was very surprised to get a beautiful 2-page handwritten letter in return. And Dana gave me all sorts of advice about editorial cartooning, and he really finished up with something that has always stuck with me. He wrote, "Don't let the glut of cartoonists get you down. If it's a great job, and if you really want it bad enough, you'll be able to do it." Such encouragement from Dana and other cartoonists like Mike Osborne, who currently does Animal Crackers, and a very fine caricaturist named Rod Smith Jr. really kept me going. By 1987, I was experimenting with different types of artwork and different types of styles of drawing, and I pretty much was trying to get the thickness and the thinness of the line of the cartoons and the drawings. And this is a very important element, by the way, when you draw cartoons and art generally. And I was really drawn to sticking with using brush and ink, which is black India ink. It's very professional looking. And also doing my lettering with a steel-tipped pen, a dip pen. So all my cartoons, as a matter of fact, have been done with only these implements and other things used in hand drawing. I've never used any computers in any of my artwork. So here are a couple of unpublished cartoons from 1987. The first one shows the Supreme Court, and the columns of the building are actually held up by vials of LSD. This comes from a time that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, who had experimented on a U.S. soldier with LSD without his knowledge. The next cartoon shows an old, worn-out tree with no leaves or anything. It's pretty much dead, but the caption has racism. And at the base of the tree is a new sapling with the date 1987, and the caption reads, of course, "Roots, the next generation." That's very apropos for this day and time, sad to say. By the late 80s and the early 90s, I was seeking freelance cartooning work pretty much anywhere I could find it, but I was also trying to break into the gag market, and I was sending samples of cartoons to the New Yorker, which had a long history of publishing all sorts of gag cartoons in its magazine. And this example of a New Yorker submission is one that I think is pretty typical of what I did at the time. It shows 2 cans of what are essentially garbage cans, but one is marked garbage and the other is marked trash. The trash being of a higher quality of garbage, of course. I also became very, very interested in creating my own comic strip. So I tried various ones, and I wanted to get those syndicated. I sent them out to syndicates that were very popular at the time. The idea of syndication, of course, is to have your cartoons distributed nationally and internationally and creating a cash flow for yourself. And that's something which changed to a large degree when the internet really got going, because distribution became very different, although there are obviously a lot of syndicates still around. In the 1990s, I was fortunate to start with the Orlando Business Journal. And I was drawing editorial cartoons and illustrations that were related to the business industry at that time. In fact, here's one example for the Orlando Planet Hollywood restaurant. Disaster themes are very, very popular with editorial cartoonists, because you can do a lot of play on the subject matter on words and things like that. And in this case, you've got this meteor representing creditors, and it's hurtling toward Earth with the Planet Hollywood in its sights. By 1999, I actually switched papers, and I was hired by the Apopka Chief, which was my hometown paper, to create editorial cartoons for them. Now, the editor at the time is actually the editor to this day, a gentleman named John Perry. Now, my subject ranges were actually supposed to be local and county and state. So I really couldn't do national and international pieces. But that was fine because there was plenty going on in the state of Florida, in the local area, to draw subjects on. One of the first cartoons I did is shown here. And this is another very popular technique that cartoonists use. What they do is they actually switch roles. And as you can see, you've got a posse, a group of men on horses chasing a stagecoach. And the stagecoach is driven by an Indian. And there's an Indian with a bow at the top, and he's looking at the viewer, and he's saying, "Say, what's wrong with this picture?" So what was happening, of course, is the state of Florida was after the Indian casinos because they wanted a piece of the action from the Indian casinos, and there was a big legal fight over that. The next cartoon that I did also had a state focus, and it was a pledge bill. And what I did for that is I put the flag that was raised on the moon in the picture, and I had a couple of aliens on the moon, and one saying to the other, "Oh, stop arguing and just say the pledge." So that was something that was going on at the time and was a very, very hot topic, whether the Pledge of Allegiance should actually be required by people who were in school, for example. Now, January 2000 brought another change. And the change that came about for me during that time was I came into work one day at the Apopka Chief, and John Perry said to me, "You can't offend anybody with your cartoons." I said to myself, well, basically my job is to offend people, so how am I going to do this? But John evidently had gotten some complaints about a cartoon that I had drawn, and he wanted to make sure I wasn't going to upset anybody and get some bad publicity for the paper. Well, my reaction was to just go along with it, left the paper that day, and immediately went out to find another newspaper to work for because I knew that I wasn't going to be there very long if I was going to offend somebody without my knowledge. I didn't have many options, really. There weren't many newspaper opportunities at the time to go out and to solicit to work for as editorial cartoonist, but I did have a creative thought. I said to myself, you know, there's some Spanish language newspapers in the area, and I think I might have a go at that. So I started looking through them, and one paper in particular, La Prensa, had just gone through an expansion, and they did not have any cartoons whatsoever. So I thought this was a good opportunity. Now, as far as my Spanish language abilities, well, they're pretty much limited at the time to 2 classes in university in Spanish and 6 weeks studying in the city of Bogota, Colombia. So I knew with some help I could create a Spanish language cartoon because I pretty much could get myself in trouble with a bar girl in Tijuana. As a general rule, listening to and reading language is easier than, say, writing, and then this is followed by actual speaking, which is the most difficult of the 4 areas of a language. So it was going to be a matter of getting some help, but I felt I could do it. I made an appointment with the owners of La Prensa. There were some Puerto Ricans named Dr. Manuel Toro and his wife, Dora Casanova de Toro, and they were very welcoming to me, very interested in the possibility of me creating cartoons for La Prensa. I pointed out something to them which I don't know that they really had considered before I came, and that is having a cartoonist on your staff creates a certain prestige for the paper, particularly for a Hispanic paper because there just, again, really weren't a lot of cartoons around in Spanish. So I was very fortunate and I got hired. Now, I would receive help with my Spanish, and I was no longer restricted to local and state issues. I could do pretty much anything I wanted, whether it was Hispanic related or not, whether it was local, state, international, and this really made me happy because I felt I really had a lot of freedom to explore a lot of areas of current events that were going on through my cartoons. One of the never-ending topics is shown here, and that is immigration with our southern neighbor. You have the progress of immigration with two gentlemen at the starting point of a race, and they are in cement galoshes, basically. You have the United States and Mexico. So that's the starting line, and you do get the impression that neither of them are going to make very much progress in that area. So one of the things that I questioned myself about when I actually started with the paper, and I discussed this with a news editor, a gentleman named Bienvenido Oliveira, is what should I do about my name? My name is obviously not a Spanish name or Hispanic name. And he simply said, it's your name, use it. So I went with that. I didn't feel like I had to use a pseudonym in order to play to a Hispanic audience. Several months later, there was a new news editor. His name was Ruben Funes, and he was Argentinian. And Ruben had a wonderful grasp of both Spanish and English, and he had a lot of newspaper experience. So I was very fortunate to have him as an editor. And initially, I went into the the newspaper every week, and I actually turned in my cartoon, and I had another one that was edited and ideas that I went over with Ruben, things like this. But later on, this was done by email. Now, one of the things that you would do as a cartoonist is you would do takeoffs on real and fictional historical characters. This is a very common approach in cartooning. Here's one such imitation of Don Quixote fighting the windmill. So you have the Boy Scout of La Mancha, and he's on a horse, and he's going to charge this windmill representing local government giving money to the Boy Scouts. Of course, he's charging with a lance that has a sign draped from it. It says no gays, because at the time the Boy Scouts were not allowing anyone who was gay to be involved with the program. And the horse is looking at the reader and saying, what a shame. Now, back to visiting La Prensa. When I visited La Prensa, oftentimes there was a different receptionist out front. So when I would walk up, she would ask me in English, what can I do for you, sir? And I would tell her in Spanish, I'm the editorial cartoonist. I work here. I'm here to see Ruben Funes, my boss. And it shocked her a bit, and then she'd pick up the phone, make a call, and then tell me to come in. So this happened several times. But I must say that that sort of experience was very uncommon, because I always had a uniform kindness and respect from the people at La Prensa, and I had no issues really with anybody. And in fact, I was invited to a lot of social events of the newspaper as well. Now, with that thought in mind, let me turn to a lighthearted Disney-related cartoon. In the instance of Disney's 100th birth, I did a cartoon with the Seven Dwarfs. And in this case, you had the dwarfs lining up, and they're marching along, and the lead dwarf is saying, hi-ho, it's off to Madrid we go. Well, the rest of the dwarfs are horrified at this, and the caption reads, with the 100th anniversary of Walt Disney's birth, the Spanish town of Moyacar is intensifying its claim that he was a Spaniard. Now, this is something which you find, unfortunately, these historical inaccuracies appear, and it's a great opportunity to get in there with a cartoon. Also, too, in the lower left hand of the cartoon, you see in Spanish where I've written, with apologies to Snow White. That's another something that cartoonists like to do, is they fit in a little message there to someone who may not be in the image, but is connected in some way to the subject matter. Now, although I had a great reception from Hispanics regarding my work as an editorial cartoonist in Spanish, unfortunately, it wasn't the same with several Anglos that I knew, because I sometimes received impressions from them about my work for a Spanish language newspaper, and although they were not directly vocal in their objections, the insinuations that they made were plain enough. Things like, I was promoting the language of Spanish over English. This has come up at various times in our state's history and obviously is a very touchy subject. But for me, language is, well, it's simply a way to communicate. And communication brings about understanding. That was my job, to get people to understand a subject in the cartoon that I was doing. So I needed to be an effective communicator. Then people would ask me sometimes, why don't you do cartoons in English? Well, I've done cartoons in English, I told them, but I work for a Hispanic newspaper, so I have to do cartoons in Spanish. So I think sometimes people really ignored the obvious, and they didn't understand, because I wasn't Hispanic, why I was doing Spanish language cartoons. Also, too, I would explain to them that many Hispanics in the United States speak English just fine, but they prefer Spanish. Also, the fact that Puerto Rico, whose inhabitants are U.S. citizens by birth, Puerto Rico really occupies a very strange niche in the United States history, because it became an American colony over 100 years ago. And for Puerto Ricans, Spanish is their first language, although many of them, if not most all of them, do speak English as well. Many Anglos speak as though Spanish and Hispanic are interchangeable words. This is not the case, because when you're talking about Spanish in this context, it's referring to the language. Hispanic is broadly relating to the culture, people, and the nations, with national links, historical links to Spain and the countries that used to be at one time part of the Spanish Empire. So there's a difference there. The other thing that was, I should say that I was accused of, so to speak, was that I was pro-Hispanic. Editorial cartooning was my job, and this had everything to do with the way I was raised. When I was growing up, I was pretty much told that when you accept a job, you put 100% in it, and that's what you do. So it didn't matter who I was working for and what language I was using, I needed to do my very best. So oftentimes I dealt with issues, of course, affecting not just Hispanics, but people all over the world. And in that regard, sometimes what I would try to do is bring a topic to attention that was either missed by the media or was very much underrepresented, such as this cartoon about a serial killer in Mexico. What you have is you have a police officer, and he's pulling a cart that has a coffin on it, and the coffin says serial killing, and it has a sign at the back where the actual license plate would go, and it says Juarez. And the police officer is saying, incompetent, we're burying them as fast as I can. What more can you expect? So that's what was going on in Juarez at the time. You had a serial killer going around killing dozens and dozens of women, and the police were completely incompetent in dealing with this. They would capture someone, they would arrest somebody and torture the individual. The individual would confess because they wanted to stop the torture, and the killings would go on. So this is really why I created that cartoon. Then the other thing that came up sometimes that I heard from Anglos is that I was un-American because I was working for a Hispanic paper. Well, I'm a native Floridian. There's a lot of people in this state from a lot of different places. So I don't think I was un-American at all in what I was doing. I think I was representing as best I could the diversity in the state in which I live. And I really wanted to reach out on issues that dealt with national events, such as the 9/11 disaster that occurred, the tragedy. And I did the cartoon several actually years later that was related to the investigation of 9/11, as shown here. And the caption reads, "The Politics of Tragedy, Questions and Accusations," with the question mark representing the 9 and the exclamation points representing the 11. One of the things that I ran across as a cartoonist for a Hispanic paper was no less at the National Cartoonist Society meeting in Boca Raton, Florida in 2001. There was a general business meeting that occurred every year at the National Convention, and I attended this. And it's at this meeting I realized how alone I actually was as an editorial cartoonist for a Hispanic paper. I raised my hand and I stood up and spoke to the entire room, and I introduced myself, and I said, you know, there's a huge segment of the population in the United States that are Hispanics, and I think we're really missing out on reaching these people because there is a lack of cartoons in Spanish. Well, the response, well, it was silence. Silence. Nobody had a single word to say. Yes, I knew I was alone as an editorial cartoonist in Spanish. Language is complicated. Language issues weren't just confined to Anglos thinking whatever they thought about Spanish. Spanish language is different in every Hispanic country in Latin America. And to give you an example, I went into the newspaper one day and I had a cartoon with the word boomerang in it. Well, Ruben looked at that and he said, we can't use this. I said, why? He said, because boomerang is a different word in every single Latin American country. So that was a big lesson for me. I needed to use my dialogue and identifications of my cartoons that would appeal to the widest audience in the most commonly used language in Spanish, and the commonly used phrases and wording and this kind of thing. So that was a challenge for me, but I was certainly up for it. Now, I began self-syndicating some of my Spanish language cartoons throughout Florida, but also to other states like New York and Arkansas and Kansas, for example. And in some cases, I had cartoons that were sensitive in nature that La Prensa simply did not want to print. This drawing appeared in the Washington Hispanic, and in this case, I've actually replaced the Spanish with English. So you have a couple of bishops at the Vatican, and one is pointing down into the broad plaza, and he's saying to the other one, look, His Holiness has greatly increased his security. And the other bishop whispers, that's a choir boy. Well, this was at a time when there was a big scandal in the church with sexual abuse. So that did get published in the Washington Hispanic. No objections. An editorial cartoon, by the way, doesn't really have to be humorous. A lot of people think, well, it's a cartoon, it has to be humorous. In the case of an editorial cartoon, it's a misnomer. And here's a good example of an editorial cartoon that contains no humor whatsoever, but actually appeals to a very broad audience. You have a caption that reads, "The logical answer to the Hollywood writers' strike," and a book that has simply "read" right across the cover. There you go. No humor, but a very, very clear message about what was going on in society at the time. Not too long after I started at La Prensa, I began having a cartoon strip that I had created getting published, and I was very, very pleased with this because I worked very hard on creating the entire cartoon and all the characters, and I thought, you know, this was a good opportunity to step away from being an editorial cartoonist, but yet have some fun. Now, it was called Eloises, which means the Oasis. And this comic strip actually ran for over 3.5 years in the newspaper, and I found my voice in this comic strip, and it did, like I said, give me a chance to relax. Here's the gang of Eloises, which originally started out with these 4 characters, actually 5 characters, and there was others that were added later on. But the characters were all based on people that I knew. This included my older and younger brother. All the people represented in the comic strip, none of them spoke Spanish. So I really had an opportunity to make fun of them and things that they did, and they never knew about it, even to this day. The main character was a character named Scorp, which was like a stylized scorpion, and this was a nod to my old school, the mascot in my old high school, Satellite Beach, Florida, the Satellite High School Scorpion. And also another character was a guy named Detective Andy Falta, and he was based on a former boss who would never take any responsibility for her screw-ups. So Falta was always trying to, you know, work on a case, or he was trying to you know, solve something on the trail of a criminal, but something would always get fouled up. In these 2 episodes, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You have Scorp asking Detective Andy Falta, haven't seen you in a long while, Detective Falta, where have you been? Falta says, I've been investigating the Jack the Ripper case. Okay, Scorp says, well, isn't that a very old case? And Falta responds, I solved it. This is Jack. And what you have is a picture, of course, of the Jack of Spades. And the Jack of Spades is saying, will somebody please explain to this guy that I had a winning hand? Now, the follow-up to that, the second episode, you have Falta inquiring with the Jack of Spades about, the seriousness of the issue. And he's saying, look, I know you're Jack the Ripper, and no more joking around. To this, the Jack of Spades responds, I want to speak to my lawyer. And then the next frame, you have Falta saying, somehow I don't think that's going to make any difference. And you have the Joker card handing a business card to Andy Falta. So those are a couple of episodes from the Eloises comic strip. Fortunately, the sort of engagement with comic strips and cartoons, other than editorial cartoons, could be worked into my editorial cartooning at times. And it gave me an opportunity to make social comments about the cartoons themselves. In this cartoon, you had Speedy Gonzales being hauled away in a paddy wagon, and you can see his hat being left on the ground, and it says, Adios, Speedy. Speedy was a cartoon character that was very popular for decades from Warner Brothers, and I grew up with him, as did millions of other people. Well, unfortunately, the political correctness had interceded, and the caption reads, Speedy Gonzales has been kicked off the Cartoon Network because he's a stereotype for Mexicans. So that's, again, a good example of a social comment on cartooning and how it does affect a lot of people. Now, I felt tremendously gratified that I had the freedom to cover a wide range of subjects while I was working for La Prensa. And I will now go through several examples of cartoons that I did through the years. This one represents what was going on in Colombia for many years. The FARC guerrillas were actually killing people, and they were kidnapping people and getting ransom and things like this. The FARC had started out, as many freedom fighters do, trying to change the government. Well, that didn't work out so well, so they started with the killings and the kidnappings. And the FARC spider here is saying to the reader, why do the people of Colombia detest me? There you go. Another Latin American cartoon that I did at the time centered around the Venezuelan leader, Hugo Chavez, now the late leader, Hugo Chavez. And I used the cast from The Wizard of Oz at this time. And at the top it says, if I only had, and the Scarecrow says, a brain. And the Tin Man says, a heart. And of course the lion says courage. And the people of Venezuela say, if I only had an option. Unfortunately, there are some pretty tragic circumstances that get dealt with in editorial cartooning, and one of them is the situation that existed in Mexico at the time, and there were a lot of Mexican miners who were losing their lives because of very, very dangerous conditions in mines. And this cartoon represents that, where you have the mine cars coming out from the mine, and they're filled with coffins. Because of the lack of jobs for people and the poverty, people in Mexico were forced to go into these mines and try to make a living. And for some of them, it cost them their lives. Now, Mexico, of course, as a lot of people know, has a lot of issues, not just with dangerous working conditions, say, but also with drug cartels. And just because you were captured and put in prison as a drug lord didn't mean your power went away. This cartoon really represents that. The La Palma maximum security prison in Mexico is a place that is the center of this cartoon, and you have somebody who has literally ordered an assassination from the prison, and he's sticking a gun as representative of the assassination out, and somebody else is saying good shot with smoke coming from the gun. So the drug cartels really continued their drug wars from the prison in spite of being in a maximum security prison. On a little bit broader front, because this had international implications, here's a piece that I did about the Chilean leader Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, who was a very brutal dictator in Chile for many years. And he was eventually arrested and it was supposed to be put on trial. But things didn't really go as planned, because what happens with a lot of these people who are despotic leaders and dictators, once they get caught, they seem to have a lot of health problems all of a sudden. And he really escaped any sort of serious justice, and he's doing it in this cartoon over the graves of the folks that disappeared when he was in power, the ones who were dead, and finally there's a gentleman here who's been tortured and he's chained to a tombstone as well. I didn't do a lot of cartoons on the war in Iraq, although I certainly could have. But I really felt like there was so much going on in other areas, I didn't need to focus just on that, because there were a lot of cartoons out there at the time on what was going on in Iraq. But several years after the war began, I did publish this cartoon, which shows two mice, and they're in the proverbial maze, and there's signs all around that say, you know, exit from Iraq. And one mouse is asking the other about, hey, what do I do now? They made a map of my mind, and I ended up here. So they don't know where to go. They're trapped in this maze. They can't really get out of Iraq. And of course, that became actually just what the United States had to deal with in that country. Sometimes I had to deal with the scientific material, and I dealt with mapping the genome in this one. And what I did was I took a figure from history, Christopher Columbus, and he's on his ship, the Santa Maria, and someone's asking him, Captain Columbus, according to the gene map, we're here. What do we do now? Well, of course, the ship is going down this precipice, this huge waterfall, and at the bottom it says commercialism or mercantilism. So the finding the map of the gene map meant that, okay, now it's going to be time to exploit it commercially. Along with that theme of commerce and industrialism, China in the early and mid 2000s was actually going through huge changes. They were industrializing at a tremendous rate. And this cartoon shows the progress of industrialization in China by a pig that is hopping along, and he's very gleeful. Well, he's hopping along over what is very much a ruined environment and ruined health, because the Chinese didn't take into account, at least initially, the severe effects of industrialization on the environment and on the health of their population. Coming back to the United States, at the time, Ford was having a lot of trouble. They were going bankrupt, and I did this cartoon with that company in mind. So you have a ship, you know, sinking. It's the ship of Ford, and you have a guy in the mast, and he's screaming at all the people who are gathered on the back part of the ship. You know, because the ship's sinking, they're going to try to somehow avoid getting killed, and he's telling them all, "You're all fired," and the response is like, "That's going to make a difference." You know, the ship's going down, it doesn't really matter. Okay, back to space. I really enjoyed using space as a backdrop for the cartoons. I was very familiar with the space program. I grew up, as a matter of fact, just down from Cape Kennedy. And at one point, I actually worked at Cape Kennedy in security in the late 90s and the late 80s and early 90s. So what you have in this instance is you have a lander on Mars. We were sending actual landers out to Mars, and they were investigating. And I interspersed this with what was going on in the Middle East, what had been going on for decades. So you have the Explorer, the Mars Explorer, and it's sending a message back showing two graves. And one grave says Jew, and the other grave says Palestinian. And the caption reads, "After countless years of hope, still no signs of life. Not on Mars and not on Earth in the Middle East." So no hope for a peaceful solution to that situation. This is another example of what I did regarding the Iraq War, and it dealt with the military tribunals that were a result of the Iraq War. I decided to take Little Red Riding Hood, and she's going through the forest, and it's called the Forest of Procedures because we really didn't know how to go about these tribunals for these international terrorists. And the caption reads, "The Path Towards Military Tribunals, or How Little Red Riding Hood Got Lost." There you go. One of the things that was a big topic at the time was healthcare, especially in certain Latin American countries and other countries as well. Here's a cartoon that represents a very severe health crisis going on in Panama. And that's because there was medicine that was being dispensed that was actually poisonous. It killed people. So you have the government system, health system in Panama, and you have the skull and crossbones on the medicine, and it's just all pouring out and going everywhere. Now, I did have the opportunity to take the idea of Disney World and the theme parks that we have in Central Florida and intersperse that with other tourist destinations. In this case, it was Antarctica. So you have the adult penguin screaming at the juvenile penguin, and the juvenile penguin is wearing a Mickey Mouse hat. So the adult penguin is saying, "Oh, do we want to be Disney World, or do we want to protect our environment?" And the caption reads, "The rapidly increasing Antarctic tourism." I made some statements when I could about the general situation with terrorism without maybe indicating a particular incident. And in 2006, this actually represents security in 2006, I decided to draw two tombstones. Well, one's actually speaking to the other, and he's saying, "Do you feel safe?" And the other one's saying, "More or less." That's how severe things had been, of course, after 9/11. Everybody was really jumping on the security against terrorism all over the world. A cartoon that I felt was very timely because it dealt with a subject which people very dear to their hearts was Social Security. And having a Social Security number in the United States, of course, meant a great deal to a lot of people because of the obvious money that came with it. Well, I learned that what was happening was the Social Security numbers that people had were actually being rented to people in Mexico, and they were able to work in the United States, use the Social Security number to build up their Social Security file, and yet go back to Mexico, and then that whole process continued. So that was something which I indicated in this cartoon, which it says somewhere in Mexico, Social Security numbers for rent. And the sign at the bottom says the US. That's the way to go to the US. So they eventually caught on to this, of course. I don't know how long it had been going on, but it was a very, very popular thing to do to scam the Social Security system. The last cartoon I have that I want to show you that came from the Prensa really dealt with the ongoing issue of drugs. Now, this is the supply and demand situation, I suppose you'd say. What you have is you have Uncle Sam laying down all this money fighting the drug war, and it spells the drug war, okay, in Spanish. And at the end of the line, you have somebody representing the public, the United States, and they're snorting all the cocaine because all the money just turns into cocaine. So it's this constant battle to fight against drugs while people in the United States are consuming the drugs as well. By January in 2006, I had a situation I had to deal with at La Prensa because the newspaper was no longer privately owned. It was bought out by Impremedia in New York, and Impremedia was buying newspapers, Spanish language newspapers, and they were buying radio stations all across the country. So twice in the 2.5 years that followed, I was asked to sign an agreement, a freelance agreement or a license agreement by Impremedia. Well, I didn't want to do this, of course, because this agreement really did not give me any benefits whatsoever. It gave all the rights to my cartoons in Spanish and English and my name in perpetuity, that meant forever, to Emperor Media. So there's no way I was going to do this. I turned them down twice. Well, eventually, they caught up with me, I suppose you could say, by August 2008, and they informed me by email that my services were no longer required. Well, I took offense that I got laid off by email, and I called my editor and I asked Ruben why I didn't at least have an attachment. It was a going away party. He appreciated the humor and he wished me good luck, but no longer was I going to be creating cartoons for La Prensa. Now, losing the cartoon job at La Prensa was the posturing and what have you. So they're two very, very different styles, but they come across beautifully.
We're all out tonight? Well, folks, it looks like the questions have dried up. So with that, I'm going to thank our lecturer, Marty Stein, for coming in to see us this evening. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
And I want to thank you all for watching the latest installment of the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. We will not, unfortunately, be coming to you in November. We had scheduled a concert with the Flying Horse Jazz Band of the University of Central Florida, but we decided that a jazz concert, because of the energy, just wouldn't translate well to television. So we're going to postpone that concert and hopefully be able to do it live sometime in the spring. But we will be back again in December, on December 3rd, in fact, with Elizabeth Yoko, who will be presenting a lecture on ethics that is based on the Golden Girls. So that should be very interesting. So we'll be promoting that on our social media, so be looking for more information about that particular broadcast. Meanwhile, I want to thank Ron Red, who's behind the board and who's the giver of the questions tonight, and I also want to thank Lakefront TV's crew for doing an excellent job with this presentation. Once again, I'm Darrell Owens, and I thank you for watching the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. Have a good evening.